Good evening from the State of Kuwait. Welcome to the 7 o'clock news for Saturday, the 15th of November 2014. I am Dalia Badran with the headlines for tonight. Iraqi forces say they have driven away IS militants from around Baghdad, the country's largest oil refinery. Russia faces criticism from Western leaders about Ukraine crisis as G20 summit gets underway in Australia. Russia says a deal could be reached between world powers and Iran on its nuclear program before November 24th deadline. Pakistan Prime Minister pledges his support to the Afghan president in his attempt to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table. Hello and welcome. Kuwaiti and French army forces started a joint military exercises entitled Pearls of the West, which runs until November 27th. The Moral Guidance Directorate in the Kuwaiti Army was quoted as saying such exercises come in implementation of a defense cooperation agreement between Kuwait and France. The agreement shows Kuwait's army eagerness to strengthen military cooperation with friendly countries and drawing upon their expertise to develop fighting capabilities. The statement added that a host of coordination meetings have been held over a year to unify military concepts in accordance with a strategy that aims to enhance Kuwaiti army readiness. Iraqi forces broke today a month-long siege by IS militants of the country's largest oil refinery. Ousting IS militants from around the refinery would mark another significant achievement for Baghdad, a day after pro-government forces retook the nearby town of Baghdad. This comes as the top U.S. officer arrived in Baghdad to discuss the expanded war against the IS militants. More details in the following report by Heba Abdurrahman.
Driven away IS militants from around the country's largest oil refinery. This comes a day after officials said they had retaken the nearby town of PG, which had been under militant control since June. Iraqi officials said that IS militants began withdrawing from the area around the PG refinery. The retreat would mark the end of the group's month-long siege on a strategic oil installation and a significant victory for pro-government forces against the militants. It remained unclear if Iraqi forces had penetrated the gates of the refinery. Iraqi security officials gave conflicting reports on whether or not police and army troops had entered the facility. IS militants surrounded the BG refinery in June, trapping pro-government forces inside, but a contingent of Iraqi soldiers and government-allied militia held out against the militants, who staged repeated attacks in a bid to seize the terminal. Meanwhile, the top U.S. military officer, General Martin Dempsey, has arrived in Iraq on an unannounced visit to meet U.S. commanders preparing to expand American assistance to Iraq and Kurdish forces battling the IS militants. It's his first trip since a U.S.-led coalition began a campaign of airstrikes against the militants and since U.S. President Barack Obama ordered non-combatant American forces back into the country this summer, less than 3 years after withdrawing U.S. troops from Iraq. More than 1,000 non-combat American forces are in Iraq to help train the National Army. President Obama has authorized sending up to 500 more than to support the Iraqi forces. Dempsey's visit comes in the wake of Iraqi battlefield advances touted by U.S. officials, including retaking areas around the country's biggest refinery near the city of PG. Kurdish forces pushed IS militants out of the town of Zumar in northern Iraq, and U.S. airstrikes hit a gathering of IS battlefield commanders near Mosul just over a week ago. Still, IS remains defiant and has dug into key Iraqi cities, including Mosul.
Iraqi hospital and police officials said a car bomb has gone off in a busy market area in northern Baghdad, killing 15 people and injuring 34. The death toll from the nighttime blast in the Gorayat area took to 34 the total number of people killed in bomb blasts on Friday. Iraq's prime minister said he intends to remove concrete barriers from Baghdad despite little signs of a respite from car bombs. They were designed to thwart and give a greater role to police in securing the capital. There was no immediate claim of responsibility for the attacks, which bore the hallmarks of the militants. World leaders attending the G20 summit in Brisbane concluded their first day of meetings with warnings of further sanctions if Russia did not withdraw troops and weapons from its neighboring Ukraine. Outside the summit, hundreds of people rallied against Russian President Vladimir Putin in Brisbane, demanding the international community impose sanctions on Moscow. The first day ended with U.S. President Barack Obama announcing that the United States will give $3 billion to a UN-established fund to help vulnerable countries prepare for a changing climate and develop cleaner energy. The story in the following report.
World leaders gathered in Australia's Brisbane for this weekend's G20 summit, attended by the US, Chinese and Russian leaders, among others. The Western leaders attending the two-day summit blasted Russian President Vladimir Putin for the crisis in Ukraine, threatening further sanctions if Russia did not withdraw troops and weapons from its neighboring nation. U.S. President Barack Obama said that Russian aggression against Ukraine was a threat to the world, while the European Council demanded Moscow put pressure on rebels to accept a ceasefire. As he was scheduled to meet the Russian president, British Prime Minister David Cameron also warned Russia that it would face further sanctions if it continues destabilizing Ukraine. For her part, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said the European Union was considering further financial sanctions against Russian individuals because of the crisis in Ukraine. European Council President Herman Van Rompuy also said that Europe's foreign ministers will meet next Monday to assess the situation in Ukraine and whether further steps, including additional sanctions, were needed against Russia. Outside the summit, Ukrainian Australians staged an anti-Putin protest demanding the international community impose sanctions on the Russian leader. G20 host Australia had hoped that the summit would focus on global economic growth, not security or the environment, but the comments from the leaders suggest that security will remain the dominant theme. Speaking on the sidelines of the summit in Brisbane, Obama also placed climate change at the center stage of the leaders' meeting, overshadowing talks on how to lift flagging global economic growth. He announced that the United States will give $3 billion to a UN-established fund to help poorer countries prepare for a changing climate and develop cleaner energy. The United Nations is trying to raise at least $10 billion for its Green Climate Fund to help developing nations adjust to rising seas, warmer temperatures, and more extreme weather. It also would help the nations come up with energy sources that limit or reduce heat-trapping carbon dioxide emissions from coal, oil, and gas. The summit will end on Sunday with the release of an official communique, a rundown of what the countries have achieved and want to achieve in the future.
Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said a deal could be reached this month between world powers and Iran on curbing the country's nuclear program if there is the will in Washington and Tehran. The senior Russian diplomat said today in Australia in a meeting of the G20 major and developing countries that 6 world powers and Iran had never been so close to an agreement, and it could be reached by November 24th deadline. The 6 powers, Russia, China, the United States, France, Britain, and Germany, want to ensure Iran's nuclear program does not enable it to build nuclear weapons, though Iran says its nuclear work is for civil needs. Speaking at the G20 summit in Australia, Brisbane, British Prime Minister David Cameron said there would have to be a very different relationship between Europe and Russia if, quote, we continue to see Russian troops inside Ukraine, unquote. After making the comments, the UK Prime Minister met Russian President Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, Russian President said that EU and US sanctions were a mistake and against international law and would harm the global economy as well as Russia. Russia has denied its troops are in Ukraine, but it has previously said Russian volunteers may be fighting. Pakistan's Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif pledged his support to the Afghan president in his attempt to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table, a sign of warming ties between the two neighbors. Ashraf Ghani, who arrived in Pakistan on Friday for a two-day visit, invited the Taliban to join Afghan national reconciliation negotiations several weeks ago. Sharif backed Ghani's initiative but added that the process must be fully Afghan-led and Afghan-owned. Ghani called for a joint effort to curb extremism in both countries, saying any instability in Pakistan and any instability in Afghanistan affects both countries. A cold snap is making its way across much of the U.S., bringing record snowfall, cold temperatures and icy conditions to parts of the country earlier in the season than usual. Road crews began spreading sand and salt on roads before the storm arrived, but they still couldn't keep cars from slipping, causing traffic accidents. Some schools in Boise, Idaho canceled classes and postponed their football games after the storm dropped 7.6 inches of snow on the area, setting a new record for November. The ice was part of winter storm Bozeman, which brought moist Pacific air and an unusually early bout of winter weather to the region. A strong undersea earthquake hit eastern Indonesia today, triggering a small tsunami and some panic, but no casualties or major damage. The 7.3 quake occurred west of Halmahera Island and was strongly felt in several cities in eastern Indonesia. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center later lifted its advisory for potential hazardous waves for the coastal communities. The world's largest archipelago, Indonesia, is prone to earthquakes due to its location on the Pacific Ring of Fire, an arc of volcanoes and fault lines in the Pacific Basin. In 2004, a huge quake off the tip of Sumatra Island triggered a tsunami that killed around 230,000 people. Kuwait University School of Medicine recently held a lecture for the Faculty of Pharmacy Department to explain the step-by-step regulation process of Kuwait's Drug Control Administration. Organized by the Ministry of Health Pharmaceutical Registration Unit, the lecture reiterated to the faculty the importance of knowing and following the drug registration system in order to provide the safest possible outcome for patient consumption. Reporter Badreya Al-Sarah brings this report.
The School of Medicine's Faculty of Pharmacy Department held recently a lecture entitled Regulatory Framework of Kuwait Drug Control Administration. The lecture discussed the importance and breakdown of drug registration, including factors such as the Common Technical Document, a harmonizing format for preparing files for drug registration.
It is really important to understand why do we accept and what's the criteria of decision making to approve a drug or to reject a drug, and what is the basis of evaluation of the drug product. It's also important to know that we need the feedback from the pharmacist about the adverse drug reactions happening or the side effects that may take place within any of the drug products that are happening here in Kuwait. We need the feedback from the pharmacists.
The registration of pharmaceutical products follows Ministerial Decree 302/80. Under the Ministry of Health, the Pharmaceutical Registration Unit is the department responsible for registration of pharmaceutical products containing chemical ingredients specialized for human use. This includes pharmaceutical products in all dosage forms and shapes, from tablets to injections, syrups to capsules, and more.
Because the pharmacists are the gateway of dealing with the patients or the regular people, yeah. So they have to inform them and have to satisfy them that the product they are having, the generic medicine especially, is still safe and effective. So they have to know how is it being evaluated, what's the evaluation process, and they should know that we really ask for a lot of studies, a lot of documents that prove that this is a qualified drug. I'd like to inform everybody that we need your feedback also as patients. If you have any problem with any drug you are taking, if you're having a certain side effect, even if it's mentioned in the leaflet, the product, come and discuss it with the pharmacist, and the pharmacist should communicate it to the drug control, where we receive the adverse drug reaction reports, we analyze it, we assess it, and accordingly we can take actions.
The 5 key modules for drug registration include Certificate of Pharmaceutical Product, Summary of Product Characteristics, as well as focusing on quality factors such as controlling the drug substance, active ingredient, structure, impurities, and so on, all in monitoring the post-marketing safety of drugs to ensure they're safe for consumer consumption. At Kuwait University School of Medicine, I'm Badriya Saleh reporting for the English News.
And finally, tonight, the Kuwait national team yesterday beat Iraq national team 1-0 in the ongoing 22nd Gulf Cup tournament in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Fahad Al-Anizi scored the goal on the 92nd minute from the injury time. Kuwait now lead the group with 3 points after United Arab Emirates and Oman played a goalless draw in the first match of the day. Earlier, a number of Kuwaiti fans have extolled the initiative taken by the leadership to designate 2 airplanes to transport the Kuwaiti fans to Riyadh. In other developments, Yusuf Mustafa, Assistant Undersecretary at the Ministry of Information, said the Kuwaiti media delegation covering the 22nd Gulf Cup tournament is among the largest teams of journalists following up on the sports event. He added the ministry sent 2 specially equipped vehicles for live transmission and set up makeshift studios for full coverage of the games. For a chance to see our reports again, please visit our YouTube channel at MOI Kuwait News. Before we end, here's a quick reminder of today's headlines. Iraqi forces say they have driven away IS militants from around Beji, the country's largest oil refinery. Russia faces criticism from Western leaders about Ukraine crisis as G20 summit gets underway in Australia. Russia says a deal could be reached between world powers and Iran on its nuclear program before November 24th deadline. Pakistan Prime Minister pledges his support to the Afghan president in his attempt to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table.